Hey, Dr. Johnny, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Pete.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. So we tried this 2 days ago, didn't we? But you were in the middle of a field next to what was a pasteurization museum. Is that right? What was going on there?
So yeah, I was actually in Dublin, but bizarrely I was sort of in the middle of a field. So I was at a food conference symposium called Food on the Edge, and I was at a place called Airfield, which is a working 38-acre regenerative farm, and it was sort of founded by these two ladies, these two sisters called the Overend sisters, and back in the first part of, let's say, the 20th century, they were really instrumental in reducing infant mortality throughout Dublin. And how they did that was basically they realized that unpasteurized milk was spoiling and creating these pathogenic bacteria and basically making all these kids very, very sick, and their mothers. And so they started pasteurizing this milk, selling it into the city, and infant mortality was greatly reduced as a result of that. And I was in a little shed on this farm trying to get signal and trying to get my phone work so I could beam in for this podcast.
It might be worth you just kind of giving an overview of the kinds of things that you get up to, because I know you've got many things going on. We met through one specific thing that you've got going on, which I'd like to spend some time talking about a bit later. But do you want to give us an overview of the kinds of things that you get up to on a monthly basis?
Absolutely. So I'm really a scientist. My background was an undergraduate degree in chemistry, and then I did a PhD in something called computational material science, which is a bit of a conversation stopper. Most people don't really know what that is, but the long story short is that material scientists, it's a cross between chemistry and physics, maybe a bit of engineering thrown in, and they look at materials that the world is made of and try to understand why do they have these certain properties, and how can we change those properties to give us extra functionality or to make our lives better, or to do something. So the sort of touchscreen glass on your phone, my phone, will have been devised by a material scientist, essentially. So when I finished that PhD, I realized I didn't really want to become an academic, and I'd always cooked a lot and worked in some restaurants, and so I decided to then take that sort of skill set, not really the specifics, but more that mindset of how you tackle problems and how you think about the world, and apply it to food. And so since, I guess, 2014, I've been doing that. And the first place I went after my PhD was this little place called the Nordic Food Lab, which was a spin-off of this very famous restaurant called Noma in Copenhagen.
So it's hard for me then to picture how a guy who's just finished a PhD in computational material science, who's done a bit of cooking, ends up working in a food lab. What kind of things did they have you doing?
Yes, I mean, when I finished the PhD, I said to myself, okay, look, I want to work in food. So I started staging, so going and working for free in some restaurants back in Birmingham, and one in London as well, just to get a taste of it and to sort of start to understand actually how kitchens worked. I'd worked in some bars and stuff before, but never really properly in kitchens. And I just started emailing all these fancy restaurants that have, R&D kitchens, saying, hey, I'm this super cool, super smart guy. I just finished this. I can, help you make things more delicious. And of course, I guess I was a bit naive / arrogant at that time. And of course, none of them replied, except one. And that was this guy, Josh Evans, who at the time was this head of research at the Nordic Food Lab. And he was, I suppose, intrigued by my CV and what I'd written in the little cover letter. And so then I think they said, pitch us some projects. And I pitched them this project about, again, through an experience through being at home. My parents used to just eat margarine rather than butter. And so when I would go home, I would buy butter. And then I wouldn't be back for 3-4 months. And I'd go back and there'd still be half a stick of butter. And so I went back once, and this butter had, it sort of changed colour, and it had become a little bit rancid. And I still cooked with it. I made this salted caramel sauce, and it tasted really good. And it tasted almost meaty, like goaty. And so I got intrigued. Okay, what happened? We use this word rancid to describe butter, but actually, what does that mean chemically? And then I realized that actually, what happens when butter gets old is very similar to what happens when cheese gets old. And of course, we prize and pay lots of money for 24-month Parmesan or 36-month Comté. But if I said to you, do you want to come and eat my 2-year-old butter? You'd probably think I didn't like you, right? It wouldn't, there's very negative connotations. So this research project was to do with, can you age butter in the way that you age cheese, and to create this, butter with amplified hedonic qualities.
And what's the answer? Can you do that?
Yeah, you can. And what happens is you end up with something, we called it blue butter, because it was sort of, the flavor profile was analogous to blue cheese. So it has these spicy notes, and basically what's happening is you have fats, which are this called a triglyceride. So oils and fats are all made of triglycerides, and the fatty acids break down, and you get these short-chained free fatty acids, and they're in blue cheese, so that's that kind of bitter, spicy thing that catches on the back of your throat, and you get those in these aged butters as well. So you have, this very interesting flavor profile.
When we're trying to create new flavors and new dishes, are we trying to do something completely novel, or are we trying to recombine things that people are already familiar with in new and interesting ways to kind of enhance the thing that they already like about those flavors?
Yeah, so this is a great seg onto the business that we just started. So I suppose why do people bother making new food? We have all these, we have so many amazing recipes in the world, and if you ate a different one every day of the week, probably you'd live a very happy life. So why are chefs so intent, and food companies indeed, so intent on creating new things? And I suppose there's this. It goes back to that idea of what flavor is and enjoyment, and because it's intimately tied to memory. And so when you get new experiences, it fires, I think, like extra neurons get triggered, and it's sort of somehow more thrilling than these old flavor memories that we have. So those older memories, they may be really comforting, but perhaps they're just a little bit less thrilling. So I suppose that's why chefs try to create new things, and also this idea of exploring and playing with their food and creating these new things. And of course, food is and eating is very playful. Going back to the idea of the ants or the lemongrass or the blubber and the guava, what I'm really interested in is, so we have these products like coffee or chocolate, but actually when you start eating lots of different things around the world, you realize that there are things that taste a bit like chocolate or a bit like coffee. And so I started thinking, I suppose back in the time at the Nordic Food Lab, where actually a colleague of mine, a really great American chef called Jason Ball, his project, whilst I was making this weird funky butter, was trying to make a coffee substitute. And I think he was using cabbage and obviously chicory and dandelion root are the old traditional methods of doing that. And he ended up using, I want to say something, it was like a weed that we found growing in Christiania, which is this hippie commune out the back of, in the city of Copenhagen. And so we'd found this weed, and he'd started making this sort of coffee substitute out of it. And actually the coffee substitute wasn't that brilliant, but then he made a beer with it, which was very delicious. But this idea of, there are things that share flavor compounds, and why do we have to make this thing called chocolate that we make out of cacao beans? Why can't we make things that taste very much like it, because we know and love that flavor profile, but that aren't made from cacao beans? And so you could do that as an intellectual exercise, just because, it's interesting and it's a bit of a challenge. But then when you start looking at global food systems and how a lot of the food that we eat is made, you realize that a lot of our favorite foods, whether it's meat, whether it's my beef burger or my cup of coffee or my chocolate bar made by a multinational chocolate company, there's so much damage, not just to the climate, but also to the people, typically in developing countries that are producing these products for us, and they're treated, very, basically working in enslaved conditions, treated unethically, not paid fairly. So there are lots of really compelling reasons why finding something that tastes a lot like chocolate or a lot like coffee, but isn't made from those ingredients, could actually be a very beneficial thing to pursue.
There've been attempts to make things that taste like chocolate before, haven't there? Why have those? Do you want to tell us about some of those and why those have failed?
Yeah, with chocolate substitutes, the biggest one has always been carob. So that's, I don't know where they're native to, but they grow a lot in Europe, in the Med. So I think actually somebody told me recently that on Ibiza or Sicily, They have, they're almost a sort of pest because I guess they fall and they rot and then they smell and they have to spend a lot of money clearing these carob pods. But anyway, people make a carob chocolate, and you can make carob cake, which tastes a lot like chocolate cake. But if you make a carob chocolate bar, it doesn't actually taste. It's not chocolate. It looks a bit like chocolate and it tastes a bit like chocolate, but your brain knows. And it's like, if you sell that to somebody and say, hey, this is chocolate, and they can sort of see through the magician's trick, then it will be a very underwhelming, unsatisfying culinary gastronomic experience. And that's the worst thing, So I think, a question is about labeling it and the expectations. Like, if you give something to someone and say, I promise you this tastes like chocolate, and it's not quite, then they're going to be very disappointed. If we create things and say, well, look, this isn't chocolate, but it's delicious, and it's a bit like chocolate, then I think you can, consumers will be a little bit more amenable to new tastes and flavors. But with when you look at the current state in what I call the alt universe. So when I say the alt universe, I mean alt protein and alt seafood, and now things like alt chocolate and alt coffee, where the companies that are making them typically are trying to sell them as like for like substitutes and saying, make this burger out of our alt protein and you'll never have to eat another beef burger again in your life.
Have you come across the phrase Uncanny Valley?
Yeah, so with respect
Uncanny
to
Valley.
Robotics, yeah. Do you want to describe that for anybody that's
not
familiar?
Well, I mean, with my work in AI before, we did quite a bit of work with robotics, and Uncanny Valley is kind of descriptive, isn't it, of this thing where if you say, so Wall-E from the children's show, Wall-E looks nothing like a human being. He's cute, he's endearing. We love the little guy, but as things get more and more human-like, then eventually they become more attractive. But until they approach looking like humans, and then there's this big, oh my god, that looks horrible. I can't. It's like an innate revulsion that we have. But then after that, things start to look very human, and then we believe we've never pulled it off. We believe that then they will be very attractive again, and it feels like there's the same thing in the alt universe with food.
Absolutely, I'd never thought about that, but I really love the Uncanny Valley concept. And when you look at those pictures of these, essentially very realistic looking robots, but they're not quite realistic enough, and it makes you, it's this sensation of discomfort. And I think mistrust is the thing they find, isn't it? Like, you're not willing to trust this sort of like cyborg thing that's not truly human. I think that's a great parallel to draw. And I think it's also this, I find it a bit annoying with these alt protein companies where they're making these products. Vegetables are amazing, right? I love vegetables, and I could never eat meat again in my life, and I could eat only vegetables. And I'd live a very happy life, because in all cuisines all over the world there are innumerable delicious recipes with no meat. But it's this odd thing of, they're making these things that don't have meat, but they're selling them as burgers, as hot dogs. And it's like, I feel the problem is more, it's to do with that part of the consumption. Like, why do we feel so compelled to eat a burger? What's wrong with, I don't know, like an aubergine stir fry or something? It just feels like we're not quite solving the right problem in some ways. Obviously, we're reducing meat consumption, which is good, or they are, but it just feels a slightly odd approach to do it. I think they call it skeuomorphism as well, right? Animal skeuomorphism, that idea of creating something that looks like the thing it's impersonating. So, vegan bacon as being this holy grail of things to create, and it's like, just eat tofu, just eat tempeh, it's delicious. You don't need to make it look like bacon.
Yeah, I've experienced this firsthand, because about 14 months ago, we went vegan. My wife and I, we decided, like, tomorrow we're going to not eat meat anymore. And we gave away all of the meat that was in our freezer. We just bought half a lamb and half a pig. We gave it all away. And so we start on this journey of being vegans, and I've loved it, actually. I've really enjoyed it, because, as you say, vegetables are amazing. I think we're lucky because we live in the 21st century in the UK. It's not that hard to be a vegan at the moment. Yeah. But I was very gratified to see that you can still have a dirty kebab with stuff that tastes like kebab meat. But I'm starting to get this fatigue of there's something in my food that tastes like it's supposed to be meat, but it isn't meat. And
Yeah.
I feel that we're still in the uncanny valley with alt meat at the moment.
I was just going to say that the big thing with those alt meats is they, at the minute, they taste like bad. They taste like very poor quality meat. They don't taste anything like really good quality meat. And look, I'm a meat eater, but I'm very careful about the meat I eat. And I think animals can form an important part of sustainable agricultural systems. Actually, jumping back to the idea of who in the world can afford to not eat meat, because it's not everybody. You look at Greenland, and essentially there they consume a vast portion of their calorific intake from animal products, something like 80%, and that's because they live in an environment where you can't grow many vegetables, even if you really, really wanted to. So animals, those seals and various seabirds, are their lifeblood, really. So we are very lucky that we have this choice and we can think about that. But there are lots of people living in places in the world where they are not able to detach themselves from meat in the way that we are. I suppose, your question was where's that going with the Uncanny Valley and alt meat?
Yeah, because when you come out the other side of that Uncanny Valley graph, you come up with things which are actually as attractive as the thing that you're trying to make, and maybe even more attractive. So you can get AI models now that can just generate millions of pictures of people who don't exist, and they're very attractive people. So I'm just wondering, like, once we come out of this Uncanny Valley, are we going to be able to produce foods which are not meat-based, but that tastes... Are we going to get to a place where this food is objectively very, very good, right? So it's got no hormones in it, it's got no antibiotics, it's got low cholesterol, yada, 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 and it's fucking delicious. Are we ever going to get to that point, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I mean, and actually so with this chocolate project, our ambition is to make something that doesn't just taste like chocolate, it tastes better than most chocolate, or tastes better than the chocolate we're trying to replace, because we're not anti-chocolate, we're anti-chocolate made with very bad practices, so bad with respect to inequality and ethics and climate change. But that, unfortunately, is about 80% of the chocolate market. But there are lots of amazing chocolate producers growing brilliant chocolate and doing brilliant things that we want to support and work with them. But on the, I think this applies to the whole of that alt universe. I'm sure we will end up creating these things that are, as delicious, more delicious than the things they originally tried to create, or at least delicious in a different way, in the same way that, an ice lolly is delicious in a different way than a hamburger is. They're both really delicious, but there are times when you want one and not the other. But I think certainly what you will see, as certainly with the alt protein world, so now they're trying to build these single, sort of single muscle pieces that will actually look like a pork chop, and structuring the fats to run through it so it looks like marbling. And the progress is, it's happening very rapidly. I'd still say it's quite a way off from my tastes. I don't think it's still not close, but I think when you get to that point, then you'll probably see a decoupling from those traditional animal shapes. Like, there's no reason anymore to have it as a sausage or a burger, other than those are quite convenient shapes to basically hold in your hand, which is why they're that shape, between some bread.
Yeah. Do you want to speak about Cacao then, and what you're doing to change the world there? I think there's. Tell me if this is a quote of yours. I read somewhere. I think you said cacao is as bad for the planet as meat. Did you say that? And if so, can you expand on that?
Yeah, I said. I may have said that. I think probably what I would soften it a little bit, but it's definitely as bad for the planet as some meat. So if we look just at CO2 equivalent emissions, for a kilo of cacao beans, you're looking at about, I think, 20 kilos of CO2e per kilo of cacao beans. Beef, of course, is really terrible. It's up there at 60. But if you look at cheese and, lamb, mutton products, they're between the sort of 20 to 30 mark as well, I think. So, cacao really is, and I think coffee is just fractionally lower. But so it really is up there in the mixer with being as bad for the planet from the perspective of carbon emissions alone, as these things that we would, you would think, okay, cheese, the dairy industry, the meat industry, people have, I think now, or a lot of people in the world have this intuitive sense that, okay, these are really bad, they produce a lot of whatever methane, etc. But they would never probably pick up a chocolate bar and think, yes, this produces probably almost the same as a kilo of cheese or a kilo of mutton.
I see. So cacao, it's got a high carbon footprint. Is that why? Is that the central thesis of WNWN Labs and what you're doing with your chocolates?
Yeah, so just to unpack the cacao story a little bit more. So essentially, where do those CO2 emissions come from? They're predominantly coming from land use change. So about 70 to 80% of the world's cacao supply comes from just two countries in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And there what you see is, what we have seen is deforestation on a massive scale over the last 30 years. So it's that land use change, that deforestation, which is continuing, which is producing the bulk of these CO2 emissions. Now, what's also happening is as climate change kicks in and changes climates in various places around the world, these farmers are having to plant cacao crops in new places. So they're having to deforest further. So this deforestation is causing climate change, but it's also being catalyzed by climate change. So it's a double whammy. So, what we face is a near future where it becomes much more expensive to buy chocolate, and the chocolate that you buy is having a really profoundly negative effect on the planet. Added to that is the fact that slave labor and child labor are endemic in cacao supply chains. It's thought that about 80% probably of the chocolate that you would buy has passed through some form of child labor, whether it's the kind of planting or harvesting or processing. And it's about, I think, between, let's say, 1 and 2 million children work in just Ghana and the Cote d'Ivoire alone. So, these people are they're not getting paid well at all. They're at the mercy of these huge supply chains, at the one end of which are these very giant, very powerful multinational European and North American headquartered companies.
So is the desire, is the crazy dream that you'll be able to produce a sizable percentage of the world's chocolates without causing deforestation or without making use of child labour?
Yeah, so I think, again, just to reiterate, like we love chocolate, and we believe there's lots of chocolate being well made by amazing cacao farmers and chocolate producers all over the world, and we really want to support them and make sure that as many chocolate cacao producers get paid fairly, and that the way that we grow cacao globally is has the least damage possible to the world. Our vision for how we do that is that most of the chocolate that gets bought and sold now is by essentially six companies, 6 companies making chocolate, 6 companies processing cacao, and our vision really is how can we supply them with a product that can mitigate these damaging effects that currently the cacao that in their supply chains is producing and having. So we want to basically create a new supply chain that they can use that will be less bad for the planet.
I don't know if you've had time to, I don't know if you thought about this, but it feels like a lot of climate solutions that we look at, there are obvious levers to pull. So you pull this lever and that helps a lot. But then pulling that lever creates secondary and tertiary effects elsewhere, like in the supply chain or elsewhere in the world. And a naive onlooker looking at what you're proposing to do, might say, well, there are people with jobs growing cacao in these areas, and if you go and disrupt that, then a lot of those people are going to be out of work. I think it's hard to change one thing without changing other things, but I don't know whether you thought much about that.
Absolutely, we're very aware of that, and we're talking with chocolate makers here in the UK where I'm based, but also forming liaisons and partnerships with chocolate makers, or rather cacao producers, exporters in West Africa, to see and really understand, how do we do this without having negative secondary and tertiary effects. At the minute, obviously, we're a very tiny company, so our our kind of footprint will be very small. So I think, I suppose that how I sleep at night is that I say that we don't have to think about those problems right. We don't have to know the solutions to those problems right now, because if we launch a product in 2 months and it does really well, it'll be like 0.0000001% of the world's chocolate supply, right? Less than that. But we have to know and have this, 3 to 5 to 10 year to 20 year to 30 year roadmap of, okay, if we create this thing and consumers like it and it gets adopted and we form these relationships, either with these large companies, or we create entire new supply chains where we kind of take some of their business. How are we going to mitigate negative effects to those farmers and their families? Look, the honest answer is I don't have the solution for that yet, but it's at the forefront of our mind, and we're keen to chat to as many people on the ground as possible. And look, already we've ruffled some feathers, because we've had some chocolate makers in Mexico got in touch with quite an angry message and said, like, what the fuck are you doing? This is a stupid idea. And we said, I suppose that there's two responses to that as a new company. You can either try to ignore it and delete those sorts of comments from your social media, or you engage with it. And obviously what we did and what we want to do is to engage with those people. So we've had a conversation. We're going to organise some more web calls with them and understand their concerns and actually how we can feed into making their lives better, basically.
Interesting. So I was very lucky to have one of your... I was going to talk about the chocolate that I'd experienced, but carry on, make your point. Yeah,
I'll just add one final thing, and that's, so the really interesting thing about most of the chocolate that gets sold in the world is that very little of your, I'll say Cadbury's and Hershey's because they're two big names, but very little of that chocolate bar is actually cacao. Mostly it's a lot of it's cacao butter, but that actually gets replaced by palm oil these days, and then about 30 to 35% of it is sugar. So there's this interesting thing where most of what people, when we call it a chocolate bar and you would point at it and go, that's chocolate, but actually very little of it, less than 30% probably of most of the chocolate that gets sold is actually cacao. And then that gets even worse, that we have these things called like chocolate flavored coatings. So with an ice lolly and a choc ice, the coating on that, which you would look at and you would say, hey, it's chocolate, that actually contains even fewer cacao solids, to the extent that it can't legally be called chocolate. So actually already people are eating chocolate that doesn't contain that much chocolate. So it's just this sort of weird thing that the situation exists already.
I see. Yeah, interesting. And so your product will try to disrupt both of those things, when it not just the use of cacao, but also the use of palm oil, which itself is a massive contributor towards deforestation.
Absolutely. So we're looking at using oils that are extracted from byproducts from the fruit industry, and so we're working with a sort of palette of those at the minute, trying to find this perfect set of qualities. And of course, cacao, the reason we love chocolate is it tastes amazing, but it also has these incredible melt properties. So it has these 5-6 crystal structures, and the form that it is set in most chocolate, the melt profile is such that that chocolate melts at basically your body temperature, and it melts quite quickly, so you feel this sense of chocolate liquefying in your mouth. So whereas some other things, you put them in your mouth, they start to melt. With chocolate, it kind of the melt curve is like this, so it just feels like it's liquefying, and that's where we get this sense of quite otherworldly indulgence, and mixed with the kind of mouthfeel and the fattiness. It's just this really magical really magical product, but it's very difficult to recreate. But people do it in the chocolate industry already with various palm oil and kind of substitutes, these things called cocoa butter enhancers and cocoa butter substitutes.
So people say that chocolates will kind of make you feel like you're having a warm hug or something, that it kind of releases oxytocin or whatever. So that's not just the flavor, it's also what you're describing, the this melt profile.
Yeah, and actually there are compounds in chocolate that have a sort of a psychoactive effect. So you get a buzz off eating chocolate. And actually, I have a friend, and he said he managed to get some very good high quality cocoa powder, and he said if you eat 30 grams of that, then you get a real you really feel something kind of buzzing through your veins. So there's that element to chocolate as well. So it's a really multifaceted product.
So I've tried your chocolate. I was very lucky to try one of the revisions of it a couple of months ago. They were like these little truffle kind of things, weren't they? Really delicious. Nom nom nom. How can I have more of that? And how can people listening to the show get their mitts on it?
Yeah, so we're doing actually we're going to launch with a truffle product, and we're actually going to be doing a beta launch in December. Essentially in the UK, so we'll probably only do about 400 to 500 units, just to this will be their first large or non-bench scale production that we've done. So what we want to achieve through that is really get the word out, and secondly get people's feedback. Do they like it? What are their motivators for buying it? Understand our market a bit more clearly, and really just start this conversation of what do people like about this product, what's missing from it, how can we make it better. So that will be going live on our website in about early December, let's say. The other really interesting thing, touching on the reference of like what else is in chocolate, but dogs are essentially allergic to eating chocolate, but our product actually won't have the chemical compound that dogs are allergic to. So you'll be able to share and enjoy with your dog this delicious non-chocolate chocolate as well.
Can you cast your mind like in the last 5 minutes, cast your mind into the future, like 30 years, and what does that look like? The way that we produce food, the way we use land in general, is a big contributor to global warming. What kind of things do we need to change? What kind of things need to happen in order for that no longer to be the case, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest problems with the current food system is that people are just so divorced from their food and where it comes from and how it's been grown. And of course, if you don't know anything about how something came to be on your plate or in your supermarket, then you don't know whether... You don't know, and you don't care whether that thing was good or bad, right? You don't care whether it's the most sustainably produced onion in the world, or whether it was, grown with child labor and slave labor. You don't know. So we need to re-engage people with how food is made, essentially. And of course, we're very lucky to live in this period of time where lots of people in the world no longer have to spend most of their day growing their food and then processing their food and making their food. And that's what our ancestors had to do for tens of thousands of years. And that was probably not, maybe not a terrifically brilliant way to live. And so we're lucky that we have access. We've devised these ways to produce food at a large scale for people, but we've just sort of overshot the mark, and we've kind of lost our way. And now you look at the way that monocultures are the dominant paradigm of how to grow cereals and other crop and to produce animals as well. And there are so many terrible things about that approach, and we need to scale it back. So re-engage people, like everyone, consumers. And then, I think we need to engage politicians. I still don't feel that a lot of politicians talk about agriculture and farming a lot. It's not cool to talk about, and I think they don't really understand. They don't understand farmers, and unfortunately that means lots of farmers also feel like they're being left out of the conversation. And we need to, farmers are the people that have this knowledge of how to make this food, so we need to engage with them. So it's getting politicians to engage in that and basically learn more and understand more. And I think then the other big pillar would be these corporations who now have massive power and basically dictate the way these food chains work, whether that's companies like Unilever, Mondelez, etc., Nestle, or the supermarket chains, which have huge buying power. So making sure they understand, feel a responsibility, but also perhaps legally, or definitely not perhaps, have a legal responsibility to do best, to do the right thing, to have some very clearly formed best practices in place.
One problem that I just can't see what the solution could be, and so I'm not expecting you to have the solution at your fingertips, is it feels like a lot of these problems are to do with the fact that we have all become so accustomed to cheap food is abundantly available, and it's all just so damn cheap. You can buy a chicken for like £1.50, and it feels like a large part of the solution might be that the cost of food needs to go up, and it feels like for a large segment of society that's the last thing that we need, and I don't know how to square those two things.
Yeah, but and so it also raises this other important point that vast parts of global food, agriculture systems are subsidized by governments. So if you look at corn and beef in the US, but then basically in every common agricultural policy in Europe, all of these things are basically propping up these food systems. So it's just a system that it doesn't work, but it works just enough to kind of keep spitting out food at the end, and basically making sure that the people whose interests are best looked after continue to be looked after, because they're in positions of power and able to kind of lobby governments, etc. But yeah, for sure, lots of the food we eat is definitely way too cheap. I suppose I think you can cook very cheaply, right? And again, this goes back to this idea that vegetables are fucking delicious, and we should just eat more vegetables and cook more with vegetables and pulses and grains, because those are way cheaper to produce than even chickens or whatever farm salmon or wild salmon, etc.
So is part of the future then, part of the future solution, that people or maybe even communities grow some of their own food?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of powerful things of why that's a good idea. So one, you get that deeper engagement, as there's a woman called Darina Allen who was at this thing, Food on the Edge, yesterday, and one of the other presenters requoted her, but she said if people knew how difficult it was to grow a carrot, they wouldn't top and tail it. And it's that thing of, if you really have grown your food or being involved in its production, then you really care about it, and you care about every single part of that carrot, or every single lentil, every single grain of rice. So there's that. I think there's also just food, as we know, going back to that point at the very start, it's a very emotional thing, but it's also very communal. It brings communities together. So there's also all sorts of secondary and tertiary positive effects for societies that happen when you get people cooking and growing together. But then secondly, we can take some of the burden off of these having to grow food in these vast monocultures, and we can start to sort of decentralize food production a little bit. I have the personal example of my grandfather. My grandparents were just working class Burmese. They had this allotment in the middle of Birmingham, and he was able to produce food that clearly it didn't wholly sustain him and his 5 kids and their families, but of a family of broader family of like 17, 18, we were all probably eating his tomatoes and rhubarb and potatoes at various points of the year, and it meant that my mum and dad didn't have to buy so much stuff from the supermarket. So it can be done, and I think it's actually not that complicated. Another great quote from an amazing guy, Jose Andres, this Spanish American chef. He's done all sorts of amazing sort of social gastronomy and enterprises, not least during various kind of earthquakes, I think in Haiti, tornadoes, and then also during COVID. But people say, people sit around the table at the UN and create 30-page manuals and pamphlets on what we should be doing, and he just says, what did we do? We started cooking. It's as simple as that. Just start cooking, and you start cooking and you feed people, and then you figure out, okay, what needs to be done and whether it works or it doesn't work. But actually, if you just make that step, if you just start cooking, feeding people, making food, then that's probably the most powerful thing that we can all do, and that I would extend that to not just cooking but growing as well.
That seems like a great place to end it. Dr. Johnny Drain, thanks a lot for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.